time slot, no more than 10 minutes.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
We get the question.
Yeah. Break. How long are you going to speak for?
Is Jack coming?
Yes,
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Jack going first.
No, he won't be here for the start. Right, I think we will make a start. Just introduce myself to start with. My name's Paul Goggins, Member of Parliament for Wythenshawe and Sale East in Greater Manchester, and I'm also the Vice Chair of the All Party Parliamentary Group for the private rented sector, a group that's been in existence now for about the last 2 years and is providing opportunities to debate the kind of issues we're going to discuss this lunchtime with colleagues in Parliament on a cross-party basis. I'm delighted we have 3 speakers with us this afternoon. We have Alan Ward, who is the Chair of the Residential Landlords Association, and Alan will speak first. We also have Councillor Clyde Loakes, who is the Labour lead and Vice Chair of the LGA Environment and Housing Board, and Clyde, we're delighted that you're here. We also have Jack Dromey, who's not yet here, but he will be here shortly, and he will speak third. And obviously we need to make sure that there is some time for discussion and also make sure that people have time to get out and get across for the leader's speech, those who wish to do so. So by all means, please help yourself to more sandwiches if you wish. But without further ado, Alan, I'd like to introduce you. You're very welcome.
Paul, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And can I also thank Clyde and Paul and Jack in his absence for the moment for being here today. And also, I wish I could thank him personally, but the engagement that we've had with Jack in the last 18 months while he's been in post has been terrific. His work rate here, as I'm sure you know, at conference has been phenomenal as well. And although we don't always agree, we have some extremely constructive discussions about the private rented sector. So, renting, why can't it be first choice and not second best? You see, I'm a landlord, and why am I regarded as a rogue? I provide one of the basics of life. It's a home. It's a good business. In Dragon's Den terms anyway, there's lots of demand for it. And I believe that all tenants deserve a home that is safe, legal and secure. And I mean, it's not going out of fashion either, like today's gadgets. You won't see anybody using an iPad in 2113, but 40% of the homes in the private rented sector are actually 100 years old. So who's buying those? Well, I am for one. And why? You see, without landlords, large parts of UK housing would actually have been demolished or be in disrepair. So private landlords fulfil a market need. Take student property. It's a sort of rite of passage, isn't it, for second and third years to go out into the community, often into large houses with 6, 8, 10 bedrooms. You show me a family market for those houses. It doesn't exist anymore. They don't pass the trampoline test. The gardens aren't big enough. And communities and economies, local economies, have changed. So landlords have been the driving force to invest and improve these properties. And that benefits the local community. You've only got to see the bars and the restaurants, the takeaways and so on that benefit from that. You see, families wouldn't buy those houses. They would all be driving to Tesco's. They wouldn't serve the community as well. But 35 towns have actually regulated these areas of shared housing, not just the student market, but the affordable shared homes that young working people want. And planning regulations are being used to control the behaviour of tenants. So urban myth number 1 in my book is that landlords control the behaviour of tenants. I have about as much hope of evicting a tenant for antisocial behaviour as Cameron has of getting a 100-seat majority in 2 years' time. You see, planning controls completely misunderstand the dynamics of the private rented sector. The stable door's shut and the horse is a mile down the road in this regard. The properties causing those problems were the large houses in multiple occupation, and this planning measure, actually affects normal family homes. And what it has done there is to freeze the market and not solve the problem. Urban myth number 2, selective licensing improves the private rented sector. In Burnley, the council has prosecuted one landlord in the last 5 years. Their selective licensing renewal is on the basis of low demand. But at a recent public meeting, they said, sorry, there's no funds. There's no funds for improvements and no hope of a facelift. But government guidelines say that licensing should be part of a multi-layered approach to tackle low demand. So without investment in the area, how do they hope to alleviate demand? Burnley is expecting landlords to pay £900 per property for licensing. Well, that's 2 months' rent. So for that in a property in an area of low demand, there's no hope, is there? Newham, on the other hand, is a high-profile area, and it's one which has introduced selective licensing, as I'm sure we all know. And initially, on principle, we were dead against it. But I have to say, we've changed our mind, and it has special problems. And they are actually prosecuting, they're enforcing, they're not just taxing the landlords. And on the positive side, Paul, in Manchester, you've decided, or not you, but the local authority there has actually decided to abandon selective licensing. And in Bournemouth, the local authority had a consultation and then reflected and said no, they wouldn't use it. There are 100 laws controlling the private rented sector. They date back to 1730, would you believe? 20 of them have been added since the 2004 Housing Act, all without reviewing the cumulative impact. What we don't need is more laws, we need better enforcement. And we need more and better qualified environmental health officers who, because of the cuts, have been depleted in a lot of local authorities. It's not the good landlords, is it, who cause the problems? It's the criminals. I won't grace them with the name of landlords, as far as I'm concerned. These are criminals who fail to issue gas safety certificates, contrary to the 1988 Act. Those who put beds in sheds, contrary to the Housing Act 84, the Landlord and Tenants Act 85, and the Housing Act 88, and those others who don't meet the decent and safety standards, contrary to all the other 96 laws. But will a criminal join any register of landlords? Come on, I don't think so, do you? It's just a tax on the good guys. What is needed is a system of smart enforcement, one which allows local authorities to concentrate on the criminals. And we want robust self-regulation for the compliant majority. Those landlords who are providing good, affordable housing that is safe, legal and secure. What we want is a twin-track approach. We want self-regulation to reward those compliant landlords through a nationally recognised accreditation scheme, supported by a national code of conduct and a form of recognition logo, a safe home logo, if you like, one that is recognisable by tenants, because it's no good having accreditation, which is quite a technical word, really, that if tenants don't recognise it. What our proposals will do is provide tenants with a searchable database of good landlords. It will offer dispute resolution, the same as is being implemented for agents. And it would also allow landlords to enforce better and implement banning orders for the landlords who don't comply. So the good landlords would be regulated independently, rather in the way that building regulations are applied now by independent inspectors. So the local authorities are free then to concentrate on hunting down the criminals instead of the pointless box ticking of licensing. Let me deal with rents. It's a fairly hot topic at the moment, and no surprises, I'm sure. Rent controls, I'm against them. The last time we had rent controls, the private rented sector shrank from 55% in 1938 to 8% in 1988. There are still over 40,000 homes subject to controlled rents. And these are some of the worst properties. The rents make them unviable to maintain. And that, to me, is your evidence that rent control doesn't work. Controlling declining rents means less money for maintenance. So the consequence of that is slums in 5 to 10 years. And then think about this. If the mortgage rates go up, and there was a rate hike yesterday by one lender, 2%, how will thousands of landlords cope with the increased debt? Why is that bad? Well, if the landlord can't afford to pay their debt, then the lenders will repossess and the tenants will be made homeless. And who's going to buy those enforced sales? It could be the worst form of landlords. The CLG Select Committee, which reported earlier this year, was against rent control. It rejected it because it said it would deter investment. So did the Montague report of 18 months ago. Let's look also at the official data on rents. The ONS stats show that real rents rose by only 1.3% across England and Wales between May 2012 and 13, 1.3%. And if you take London out of that, it's only 0.8%. Now, what is affecting the debate, of course, is the hotspots in London, and I recognise that. But the Valuation Office data for March gives an increase for inner London of only 9.3%, and outer London of 3.6%. But rent capping is a proven failure, and it will result in a withdrawal of investment, and that's the last thing that Britain needs in this housing crisis. But don't expect corporate investment to come rushing in if there are rent controls, and also individual landlords wouldn't be wanting to invest further. Incidentally, over the same period, social housing rents rose by 4.2%. So where do the media get their figures? Well, I'm afraid it's from the agents. It's in their interest to puff up the rents to attract people like me, because they will be telling me that they can get a better return. And it isn't the case either. And agents also get money by churning rents. They prefer to issue 6 and 12-month tenancies. But again, the data gives the lie to all this. 1 in 3 tenancies already lasts for 3 years. Why do we need longer tenancies? Well, every landlord that I know is only too willing to keep a tenant who is paying their rent and being reasonable in occupying the property. And a tenant who is on a 3-year tenancy is actually paying on average 8% below the current rent levels. Go to 10 years and it's 1 in 12 tenancies, and their discount, if you like, is 28%. And those are the English Housing Survey figures. So what we say is give families the right to renew their tenancies. Most landlords will allow a tenancy to roll on if everything's okay, but with the right to renew, the tenant will get better security. So if the initial tenancy is 6 months or 12 months, the renewal would be on the same period, 6 or 12 months, or longer if they want. And most landlords will negotiate on that. So we can have safe homes in the PRS. We want good landlords who are self-regulating and a searchable register, like the gas safe one. We can have a legal private rented sector with properly enforced regulation against the criminals. And we can have a secure private rented sector with a right to renew tenancies so that families can put their kids into school and be near friends and family without fear of eviction. So renting, I say, can be safe, legal and secure. And also, because landlords provide a home, unlike ownership, there's no list of jobs at the weekend. And if you're young and mobile, the need to move for work or a relationship, then there's no chain, no uncertainty about selling, no lawyers' fees, and no stamp duty. So I believe that the private rented sector can be first choice and does not have to be second best.
Alan, thank you very much for your opening contribution. And can I say, not only your contribution today is very welcome, but also the fact the RLA have put on this meeting, and for your support for the All Party Group, and your willingness to engage with members of the Labour Party as well as other parties on this very, very important issue. You mentioned in your opening comments about the willingness of Jack to engage with you and your organisation, so it's very timely that Jack has now arrived, and we're going to hear from Jack next. Jack, you won't have heard Alan refer to your stamina and your commitment, but he did say that, and we all know, not just from what you've done this week, but for all the work that you're doing as the Shadow Housing Minister, that you are deeply committed and very effective in this area, and we look forward to hearing to what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much. I actually did the marathon back in 1995, and I remember saying in years subsequently, never again, but little did I know. Now, the private rented sector is rapidly growing. The statistics are quite extraordinary, actually, when you look at the 60% increase against the fall for the first time in home ownership since the 1950s. the decline also in social housing. The private rented sector is rapidly growing, has a very important role to play, will continue to have a very important role to play. It's been said to me today, will we need the private rented sector in quite the same way given the scale upon which you're going to be building at the next stages? Well, the answer is yes, and for the foreseeable future. The private rented sector will continue to expand because, as you've heard today, the ambition that Labour has is to go from the lowest level in house building since the 1920s last year to doubling house building by the end of the decade. But that will take time to ramp up. I'm going to turn off my phone, I just realised it's interfering with the mics. That will take time to ramp up, so the private rented sector will continue to expand. And I want to say one other thing about the sector, which is most landlords are good landlords. And I know that from my own direct experience. Having said that, there are real problems in the private rented sector of a lack of security, of affordability, of quality. 35% of homes don't meet decent homes standard. And there are too many rogue landlords on the one hand who prey on tenants and bring into disrepute the reputation of the sector. And there are too many rogue letting agents on the other hand. Now, our aim is that by 2020 is to move to a new vision of the private rented sector, a sector of choice. I have to say more akin to the continental model of private rented sector, enjoying a higher reputation with greater stability, crucially involving investment big and small in the private rented sector, and I'll say more about that in just one moment. Now, what we've done is to engage down a path of three parallel work streams. The first has been a very different model for the future. The second has been regulation of the private rented sector, and the third has been institutional investment, including in the private rented sector. And I'll deal with each of those three briefly. If you've not already seen the documents, the policy documents that we published, I would strongly suggest that you do so, because it spells out very clearly our direction of travel. The first was on regulation of the letting agents, described by the RICS as the Wild West, where the whole sector agrees that the time has come for effective regulation of the letting agents. It's a ludicrous anomaly that estate agents are regulated, letting agents are not regulated, anyone can set up as a letting agent, and there's horror story after horror story of both tenants and indeed landlords being ripped off by letting agents. And crucially, ALA, who represent the letting agents, believe the time has come to regulate the letting agents. The second policy document was around security and affordability. And what we want to do is to promote an approach which is flexibility for those who want, because it will always be the case that some people will only want a tenancy for 6 or 9 months, but security for those who need. And it's crucially Alan's point, which is that if you're a family planning where you send your kids to school or how you manage your household budget, you must in future be able to count upon a longer term tenancy, for example, a 5-year tenancy. You must be able to count upon that. Now, on the issue of rent, there are fundamentally different ways of doing it. We've looked at traditional rent controls, and I have to say that it's very difficult to make traditional rent controls work in the 21st century. There is a problem also in terms of disincentivizing institutional investment, but I'll come back to that later on. What instead we are looking at, and it's very much the work that Cllr's done as well, is the notion of index-linked rents linked to longer-term tenancies, so that you don't have, therefore, potentially the rent goes up after year 1, year 2, year 3, but there's a certainty in terms of the rent that you'll be paying throughout that 3 or 5 year period. Now, that is right in itself, but it's also actually a good business model for landlords, because the Jones-LaSalle study for Cllr pointed to the fact that it's better from the landlord's point of view, I think, Alan, you were saying this as well, better from a landlord's point of view to have a decent tenant on a continuing basis paying their rent than to go through the process of churn, which can very often cost about £2,000 a time to a landlord. So moving down this path of longer term tenancies for those who need, linked to predictable and more affordable rents, is very much what we want to do. And what we're doing is to engage now at the next stages with Alan and his colleagues and the sector as a whole and all of the interested parties on how one gives effect to that. Is it an incentive-based approach or statute or a combination of the two? And in terms of incentives, we've been looking at a range of things. Supply from local housing register is one possible incentive. Direct payment is another. Where, to be frank, I think we've said that there's a strong argument in favour of pulling back from current public policy in terms of the impact it has. And also, and it may be a controversial point to make, is I distinguish between after road landlords, which absolutely we will do, but on the other hand, if there is a tenant that engages in outrageous behaviour and makes the life misery of the flat or the other people in the block or the street, actually making it easier to be able to evict such tenants. Now, all of those things we're going to tease through at the next stages. The third thing we're doing is in respect of quality. That was the third of the policy documents. Because on quality, 35% of homes don't meet the decent homes standard, and therefore what we are going to be consulting on at the next stages is the notion of a new decent home standard for the private rented sector. And then it's a combination of incentive and enforcement. Incentive on the one hand, helping landlords, for example, depreciation allowances, tax relief, helping landlords to upgrade their stock, but requirements on the other hand, that every home should be a decent home in the private rented sector, as we've sought to make every home a decent home in the social sector. Now, one other point in terms of the policy direction of travel is that what we're looking at is, and we propose, and the path down which we're moving, is a national register of landlords. And the notion of that is quite simply that everyone knows who is a landlord. Incidentally, it is for positive and negative reasons. For positive reasons on the one hand, because it allows government or government agencies or councils to be able to communicate with landlords about not just rights, obligations, but entitlements as well. The negative reason on the other hand, because our view is that if you have outrageous criminal behaviour on the part of a landlord who is registered, then that landlord should be deregistered and no longer able to operate as a landlord. Now, that's everything in relation to the model of approach that we're promoting. The second work stream, briefly, is in relation to enforcement. And there, Newham, Oxford, Liverpool and Blackpool are conducting a work stream for us on enforcement. I've been myself on a raid with Robin Wales in Newham, and I have to say there's one particular house where the landlord in question was getting £35,000 of rent a year. There was 14 people packed in, and it was the most disgraceful conditions I've ever seen in my life. And in my former being, I remember when we organised the employees of gangmasters. I didn't see anything as bad as this. It was absolutely outrageous. And the idea that that landlord could ever again in future operate as a landlord, no, never again. So effective enforcement, but it's got to be enforcement that takes legitimate account of concerns expressed by the landlords in terms of how licensing and enforcement regimes might work. So they're focused on that work stream for us in terms of raising standards in the private rented sector. And what we'll then be doing is to work with the RLA and NLA and others in terms of the final stages of our policy development. Third and final work stream, so the model of the private rented sector of the future, effective enforcement by local authorities. Third and final strand is in relation to investment. Now, investment big and small, as I described it earlier on. So, for example, some of the tax incentives that we're talking about that we would put in place in terms of that model of approach that we want to promote for the future. But in addition, there is the issue of institutional investment. Now, the first serious discussion about institutional investment took place in 1981, the era that I had hair. And to be frank, very little happened subsequently. Well, one thing did happen, but very little happened subsequently. But what we've now seen in the last 5 years is a growing appetite on the part of institutional investors. And even this government has taken some welcome steps in terms of balance sheet guarantees, question how it all works. Now, we've got the British Property Federation, who are hosting for us a process, together with basically anyone who is anyone in the world of institutional investment, who, by the way, all of whom welcome the fact there's going to be a continuity of policy. But what we are determined to do is to finally make this work and work on a grand scale. And Alan, I have to say, you're right, that when you talk to the institutional investors, they do say that traditional rent controls would deter them from investing. Conversely, the kind of model that we're talking about for the future, that 2020 vision, is exactly the kind of private renter sector they want to invest in. A sector of choice, enjoying higher standards in the way that I have described. So we're determined to make that work. And just one other work strand is we've got Manchester City Council leading for us a work strand on the use of the local government pension scheme. They've got this groundbreaking, excuse the bad pun, deal in Manchester in using the local government pension fund. We've now got the chair, Kieran Quinn, with 7 of the regional, because it's administered regionally, the fund, 7 funds working together with us and other local authorities on imaginative deals that see potentially enormous investment from the institutional investors. The former chair of the local government pension scheme, a very nice, good man, Ian Greenwood, once said to me, how come that we invest in light transit systems in Hong Kong and drainage systems in South Korea, but we don't invest in building houses here in Britain? And I totally agree with that. So I suppose in conclusion this, under a Labour government in 2015, unashamedly the world will change. The world will change. We'll be building on a grand scale, as I've said, doubling house building from the beginning of the decade to the end of the decade. We'll be building on a grand scale. But the other dominant strategic priority for us is of that very different model of private rented sector for the future. Now, as part of that, of course there will be a continuing focus on the bad. But let me conclude by saying this. I also want there to be a focus on the good. Because actually, I could give you numerous examples. I have to say, by the way, the work the RLA is doing right now on the potential of a 5-year tenancy with a right to renew is, I think, a very welcome step in the right direction. I remember Waveney landlords who came to see me about the Waveney Landlords Association. It's inspirational, some of the work that they're doing, including, incidentally, cooperating in driving out the rogues locally. Also, one particular local landlord who I must say is a very impressive guy. And what he said to me, he said, look, Jack, he said, I found to begin with what you were saying a bit challenging. And he said, but then actually come to think of it, this is who I am. And this is the kind of sector I want to be in. And yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Let's change the world, and we will. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jack. Right, Clyde, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Never really a joy following Jack because he says everything that you probably want to say anyway. But perhaps if I can perhaps focus on some of the challenges that we in local government face in this. Clearly the private rented sector is an important part of our housing and will continue to be a crucial part of our housing. And I think there are, vast majority are very good landlords, but I don't distinguish between good and bad. I distinguish between good, the vast majority, poor, those that still operate within the legal parameters, perhaps don't always understand fully their obligations too well, and then the criminal. And certainly in pockets and towns and cities across the country, the criminal, almost Rachman-esque landlords are coming back, and they're helped by some of the changes in the planning laws that this government's introduced, some of the deregulation in building controls. They're helped by those sorts of things and some of the challenges in the welfare system. And they prey on the very vulnerable and weak of our community. Only last week I was walking around my wards in Waltham Forest and we came across a house with a caravan on the front drive. That had 4 people living in it. Doors were kicked down, 12 people living in a 2-storey terrace house where the landlord was selling a mattress by the night. That is the reality of what some of these people are doing in our towns and cities. So, I praise the pioneering work that is being done in Newham because I think it is really, really important. It has drawn attention to the extent of what this problem is in many of it and increasingly in our towns and cities. So, you know, really, really big issue. But local government is the right body to make the decisions for the best solutions to their local areas, and we should be trusted and given the tools to be able to do the enforcement, do the licensing, do the regularisation. So some real challenges, things that this government is not going to help us with. So I welcome some of the changes that have already been announced today by Hillary and by Jack, as we've just heard. I mean, we're trying an Article 4 on HMOs currently. You know, a problem that was exasperated when Grant Shapps came in and basically took away our ability to licence 2-storey HMOs, literally one of the first decisions he made. We don't have 3-storey properties largely in Waltham Forest. We have 2-storey HMOs, and we've got those landlords digging out the cellars without telling the elderly neighbour next door, who isn't going to take out a civil action because she can't afford to take out a civil action. So she has to deal with the cracks appearing in her walls. That is the reality of what some of these people are doing, and we need to nail them. And we need to nail them in the pocket, because what happens is if you go after a criminal landlord, he then basically hands it all over to another member of the family normally, or partner literally in crime. And that's why I think we should be saying, you know, let's not deal with the POCA, proceeds of crime. Let's seize an asset, yeah, and let's hand it over to an RSL or an ALMO or the council to administer for a period of 5 years. You'd ban people from having a dog if they treated it in a bad way, and yet we really have not got to the crux of the issue with regard to criminal landlords. And I think there's something that we can do there that I think will add to this debate. But I think there is, and this is why I say there are poor landlords, the legislative landscape for this area is complex, is arcane, is antiquated, and I think we really do need a bit of a clean sweep and it all being back up today that reflects on the fact that local government is in a good position to know its areas and to deal with its particular problems in those particular areas. Thank you.
Clyde, thank you very much. We have a few minutes now for comments, questions. Graham.
Well, thanks, Paul, and thanks everybody for contributing. I know Jack's gone. Obviously, there's a huge issue in my constituency with landlords, but is the debate between rogue landlords and good landlords a false debate? The real issue is the intermediary, the poor landlords who I would describe as long-distance landlords or amateur landlords. Isn't that where the real crux of the problem lies? The rogues are a minority. It's those individuals who just don't have the capacity to be a housing provider and who need help.
Okay. Alan, do you want to respond?
Well, for the absentee landlords, I mean, they have to have good management on the ground locally, and that's where the role of the agent should be. And I accept there is a need for improvement to the managing agent's standards. That's what they should be doing. People will invest where they see they can get a good return, but with that goes the responsibility to manage it properly.
And the amateur landlords?
Well, I find difficulty with the word amateur because most landlords are not full-time in it, so they've got some other way of earning their income. Where Clyde was talking about the poor, that intermediate category, the poor, maybe they're the poor landlords actually, and those are the ones whose behaviour needs changing. They need training, they need information, they need to recognise what the responsibilities are. They can't just offload it to a letting agent, for example. They seem to think that they can sit back and ignore their responsibilities.
Clyde?
Nothing really further to add. I mean, from my own experiences, it isn't, it isn't the absent landlord themselves. Actually, it's the failure of the letting agent that administers for that absent landlord, and that's why I think some of the things that Jack was alluding to around accreditation of letting agents and such like is really important. Because they don't take their responsibilities. They don't feed back to the absent landlord most of the time, and if the local authority is constantly raiding their house around noise or whatever, don't even feed back. So I think there's a real challenge there. But for me, it really is this kind of new generation of criminal landlords that are really kind of going hell for leather to kind of maximise the buck at the expense of some of our most vulnerable residents, and I think they're the ones we've really got to put the spotlight on and really come down hard on.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm a private tenant myself, and it's very fascinating to hear your conversations, but there's a clear absence of the role of tenants themselves in how they organise themselves to have a voice within this problem. And you talk very often about the margins of the problem, the extreme ends of the problem. But I certainly agree with you. My experience personally has been that it's just their average landlords, the people who are distant, who aren't there to return your calls, things that aren't illegal but should be the norm. And so my question is whether tenants have a role in becoming organised as part of the democratic process to face up to those practices which aren't exactly extreme but are inconvenient. And for the Labour Party and the Labour movement, surely there is a role for a tenants movement where people can have a greater voice.
Clyde?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, when we talk about tenants, we still do, knee-jerk reaction, think about social landlord tenants, and maybe something in that. It's not something that I've given a great deal of thought to, but there may well be something in that going forward as part of some of the reforms that Jack's suggesting.
Role of tenants, Alan?
Yes, you're right. There isn't a really organised voice. Shelter tends to get consulted on these matters. It is interesting, however, that their stats show they get about 85,000 complaints a year. Now, you wouldn't go to Shelter if you didn't have a problem. But that 85,000 has got to be seen in the context of 8.5 million tenants in the private rented sector. It's 1%. And I do recognise that not everybody is shiny white and all the rest of it, but a lot to do is the relationship that you have with the landlord, and if you can have a direct relationship with the landlord, that's good. But if you're dealing through an agent, then you've got a commercial relationship with them, really, and that should be about service level agreements, if you like, and they should be telling you what they will respond to within a certain amount of time.
We'll take a couple of contributions, one here, one there.
There already exists a private tenant. There already exists a private tenants organisation in London, and it's been growing fairly rapidly and has existed for the last several years. I attended an event in Islington about 3 weeks ago where about 100 private tenants came to discuss issues that they have. My questions are just a few ones. I don't think landlords have any great objection to 5-year tenancies, etc. It's the mortgage providers that seem to be the sticking point there. And I just wonder whether it might be we should look at bringing regulation for mortgage providers that they have to specify, they cannot specify restricted tenancies in that way. Other matter like this, real estate investment trusts are moving into England very rapidly. I was just talking to a manager of a real estate investment trust a few months ago. It was a German one, and we're putting £2 billion into buying existing property in East Anglia and the north of London. I just wondered whether it might be an idea that we should look at the incentives for these organisations to actually invest in new build rather than in existing properties.
Okay. We'll take a couple more. The chap behind there, and then there's a gentleman over there.
Daniel Walker-Nolan from the Electrical Safety Council. Having heard Alan praise Newham somewhat unexpectedly, and hear Councillor Loakes talk about some of the good sort of discreet enforcement that you'd be doing at a local level, is it not time to just admit that a one-size-fits-all approach towards the private rented sector isn't going to work, particularly in terms of improving management standards and conditions in places in England that are completely different in terms of demographic and sort of people that live in the sector? Any comments from the panel will be welcome on perhaps the powers that local authorities could be given to help improve the discretion.
Okay, thanks for that. There's another contribution?
Hi, I'm Joe Spitzer, Councillor in a borough in London that is going to move towards, hopefully, the Newham scheme, which is going to be a single private rental accommodation. I think that has a lot of good things to help local authorities with their enforcement, to change the attitudes of local landlords, and to raise the standard of the game. And one of the things that does come across from your organisation is that when we talk about, however the 3 categories of landlords are, whether they're good, criminal, or amateur, whatever, that most of your members are at the top end of the good landlords, the people that local authorities don't have problems with. I doubt if you've got any criminal landlords who are members of your organisation. And when you talk about voluntary self-regulation, you're not catching the people that are causing local authorities problems, right? You're not part of your organisation. So irrespective of what you do, you can't help solve the problem, which is why I think mandatory self-management licensing is something that we really need to look forward to, look towards as an organisation. One final point, when you're talking about more regulation on a national level, every time a Tories come into government, they sweep away a whole raft of regulation, and we end up in a worse position than we are before. We can't rely on our government to deliver, the next Labour government to deliver regulation, because it won't last.
Thank you very much. Clyde, do you want to respond first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe a one-size-fits-all approach, but I do believe local councils need the powers to do what's right for their local communities to deal with this particular issue, and we don't have those powers, and they are so scattergun, they are so antiquated that we really need a new landscape that ensures a little old lady with cracks down her wall who can't afford to take out civil action against a rogue developer landlord next door isn't kind of being distraught. And also, the people that in beds and sheds, are being exploited on a daily basis. We need those powers to be able to respond in the appropriate fashion at the appropriate time, not some of the lengthy processes that now have to go in place to kind of prove. You have to prove all the time something that you can see is happening, but the magistrates won't accept it. Pitiful the fines when it comes to some of these operators they hand out. Absolutely pitiful, which makes it worth them doing it for the chance that they might get catched out at another point in perhaps another 2 or 3 years' time. It's shocking, really.
On the regulation side, I'm sorry, I say there are sufficient regulations. With regard to the excavations in cellars, you can do that under the building regulations, under the construction regs for that. It doesn't have to be down to the widow next door and bring it under the Party Wall Act. On CML, yes, you're right, there has been a move. Nationwide, I think, has now broken that 12-month barrier, and they're looking up to 3 years. But the reason it's there is for the lender to be able to repossess. But they're seeing a more buoyant market, and I think they're a little more comfortable with that. With local solutions, yeah, there's got to be local solutions, but there need to be national standards. And on electrical safety, I would endorse your views about you're wanting routines. It does actually apply on HMOs, but not to the general stock. And with regards to the good members being members of associations, well, yes, thank you very much. I hope we haven't got any criminals amongst them. But that was really my point, though, that if you allow the good guys to self-regulate and put them into a national or nationally recognised accreditation scheme, one that meets national standards, then you can focus in the local authority on the criminals and not time registering us, which is an expensive exercise. We can do that ourselves. It doesn't leave us, it doesn't absolve us from the responsibilities within the local authority under that rule, but it's just like building regs. That's done mostly by independent assessors these days, independent inspectors. So it could apply in a similar fashion for landlords.
Now, I know people will be quite keen to get back across to the conference centre for the leader's speech, but any last contributions, yes?
Yeah, my name's Duncan Chubsole from Crisis Homes Charity. We do a lot of work with private landlords because maybe those single homes we haven't been a priority for social housing, so we've always worked closely with landlords directly, and we fund schemes which provide an intermediary on the ground to help relationships between landlord and tenant work, and that's crucial. Build understanding and knowledge and rectify market failure, because often otherwise the tenant won't find the landlord, the landlord won't find the tenant. 3 very quick points. I think enforcement of the existing regulations, we do have a range of existing regulations. Enforcement is spread across local authority departments. You've got environmental health officers tearing his hair out on one hand and homeless unit placing someone in that same property on the other. Housing benefits somewhere in the middle, some stuff and training standards. Taking a joint approach across central government and local government to use the powers that exist to crack down on where there are problems would make it, it's not the end of the story, but make it a huge step forward. We always say that if you want to run a restaurant, you get much, you have to go through a much stricter regime. Yet your housing main base, and actually you can get away with a lot more. A plea, this is home to Britain. Too often we don't talk openly in England context, and actually what Scotland and Wales are doing around PRS is very interesting. There's lots of things on there. I won't go into great detail, but what we're doing lastly, sorry, I missed the beginning of this, so you might have said it, but the elephant in the room is the basic ability to allow tenants to pay for a suitable property which is supported local housing allowance. And actually, our ability to improve the standards in the sector is severely hamstrung by providing buying power for tenants and ultimately from landlords who rely on them. And all everything we might want to achieve is going to be pulled back by the fact that LHA has gone up 2.5% this year, 1% next year, and the years after. And the good landlord just won't be able to let people off on those benefits, and the big problem will be pushed even further down into the beds and sheds and the sheds.
Okay. Final comments? Clyde?
No, I think that's some very sensible things just been suggested.
Don't confuse the renting of sheds and day and night mattresses for the night with proper landlords. Let's get down to enforcing against those criminals and recognise the rights of decent landlords to self-regulate. We can do a good job.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I thank Jack and Clyde and Alan on behalf of all of us for their comments and contributions. Thanks to you also for your questions. Alan, in particular, again, can I thank you and the Residential Landlords Association for the support you give by having this meeting, by supporting the All Party Group and for engaging with us on these issues. It's deeply appreciated, and thanks to Clyde for all that you do with the LGA and elsewhere. Thank you very much indeed.